I've been around. I've traveled a bit. It's about a year, you know. I don't know. It doesn't seem that long. It seems too. No. I see. I can't keep track of years anymore. They go by so fast.
In 2002, while moving an old TV, someone stumbled upon a mysterious film reel. What they found wasn't just another Fred Astaire dance. It was his boldest, strangest, and most secretive performance ever. For 60 years, this 4-minute routine stayed hidden from the world. Now, we finally know why. This is the story of the dance that Hollywood tried to bury. Fred Astaire came into the world on May 10, 1899, in Omaha, Nebraska. His birth happened during a powerful tornado that tore through the city. People later joked it matched the whirlwind life he would have. Fred's parents, Fritz and Anne, were hard-working immigrants. Fritz came from Austria and ran a brewery, while Anne stayed home with the kids. They lived in a small house on 10th Street, which still stands today as a historical landmark. Fred was a little different from the start. He was born with an extra toe on his left foot. Luckily, doctors removed it when he was just a baby, and it never affected his ability to move. From a very young age, Fred showed a love for rhythm. His family would hear him tapping patterns with his fingers while still in his crib. By the time he could walk, he was banging spoons on pots, perfectly mimicking the sounds of his dad's brewery machines. Anne thought he was destined to be a drummer, but his love for movement suggested otherwise. When Fred was 3, something scary happened. He got very sick with scarlet fever, a disease that could easily kill children back then. His fever climbed dangerously high, and doctors said he might not survive. Anne made a promise. If Fred pulled through, she would help him develop whatever talents he had. Against all odds, Fred recovered, and his sense of rhythm seemed even sharper after the illness. At age 4, Fred started taking dance lessons with his older sister, Adele. Their first class was rough. Fred tripped over his feet, knocked over a mirror, and struggled to keep up. The teacher called him hopeless, saying he had 2 left feet. Instead of giving up, Anne decided to train her children herself. She turned their basement into a practice studio with mirrors and a bar. Every morning before school, Fred and Adele practiced for hours, even when they were tired or frustrated. Anne's methods were strict, but they worked. 6 months later, Fred and Adele performed for the first time at a local theater. They dressed up in silly costumes, Fred as a lobster and Adele as a stick of butter. The audience laughed at first, but then watched in awe as the siblings started dancing. They won first prize and even got invited back for a week of performances. This success made Anne realize her children could go far. In 1905, she packed up their belongings, left Omaha, and moved to New York City with Fred and Adele. Fritz stayed behind to run the brewery and supported the family's dream for 1 year. Life in New York was tough. Anne worked tirelessly to get Fred and Adele noticed by big-name producers. Eventually, the kids auditioned for Benjamin Franklin Keith, a famous vaudeville promoter. At first, he wasn't impressed, but when he saw their routine, he signed them for a 30-week tour. The kids performed every day, traveling from town to town by train and living on simple meals like sandwiches. Anne made them rehearse constantly, even when they were exhausted. The hard work paid off. By 1907, Fred and Adele were headlining major shows. Their dances were so smooth and precise that some people thought they were robots instead of real kids. But the demanding schedule was brutal. In 1909, Fred collapsed from exhaustion and had to take 6 months off. This led to stricter rules for child performers, limiting how much they could work. After the break, Fred's dancing reached a whole new level. He and Adele started performing more advanced routines, mixing ballroom and tap dance. Audiences loved it, And by 1915, the siblings were the highest-paid child act in vaudeville. They performed for presidents and even shared a stage with Harry Houdini, who called Fred's dancing more magical than any trick I've done. In 1917, Fred and Adele made their Broadway debut in a show called Over the Top. During rehearsals, Fred injured his ankle badly. The producers wanted to replace him, but Adele refused to go on without her brother. Fred pushed through the pain and gave a stunning performance. Their big break came in For Goodness Sake. The show opened on February 20th, 1922, and ran for 103 performances before closing in May. This was a special moment because it was the first time they performed music by George Gershwin, who became a close friend. The show was so popular that Fred and Adele were invited to perform in London. There, a new version of the show, called Stop Flirting, opened in 1923 and was a huge success, running for 418 performances. Fred became a real star in 1927 with the musical Funny Face. It opened on November 22nd and ran for 244 performances. The show didn't start out well. It was originally called Smarty and got bad reviews during early performances in Philadelphia. The creators rewrote it, and the changes turned it into a hit. One of the show's highlights was Fred and Adele's playful move, called the runaround, where they ran in circles on stage, pretending to hold bicycle handlebars, while the orchestra played funny music. Even though Fred became famous later for his charm, at that time, people thought Adele was the more talented and interesting sibling. In London, she even caught the attention of the Prince of Wales, who would later become King Edward VIII. He came to their shows many times and even danced with Adele, which made them even more popular in England. In 1932, Fred and Adele's 27-year partnership came to an end. Their last show together was The Bandwagon, and it happened on March 5th in Chicago. Neither of them knew it would be their final performance. Adele had been secretly planning to leave the stage because she wanted a different life. She had fallen in love with Lord Charles Cavendish, the son of a duke. Their love story was unusual for the time because Adele was older and came from a different background. Boldly, Adele proposed to him at a New York speakeasy called 21. Fred was heartbroken when Adele retired. He had always relied on her, and many people doubted he could succeed without her. He even thought about quitting show business. To figure out what to do next, he took 3 months off and thought about opening a dance school. Fred's first solo show was The Gay Divorce, which opened in November 1932. It ran for 248 performances and introduced the song Night and Day, which became one of his most famous numbers. Even though the show was a success, Fred's move to Hollywood wasn't easy. He didn't look like a typical movie star. He was thin, balding, and had a plain face. Fred's first Hollywood role wasn't what he hoped for. In the movie Dancing Lady, 1933, he played himself and had a small dance scene with Joan Crawford. He didn't want to take the part because he feared it would hurt his chances of being seen as a leading man. MGM promised it would be a one-time thing, so he agreed. One of the most famous stories about Fred is his 1933 screen test for RKO. The report from the test was harsh. It said something like, can't act, can't sing, balding, can dance a little. Fred later admitted he was nervous during the test and didn't do his best. But the head of production, David O. Selznick, believed in him. Selznick thought Fred had a special charm that could work on screen. Despite the bad test, RKO signed Fred, and his career took off. His first big role was in Flying Down to Rio in 1933, where he was paired with Ginger Rogers. It was supposed to highlight other actors, Dolores Del Rio and Jean Raymond, but everything changed after one dance scene. Astaire played Fred Ayres, a dancer and musician, and Rogers played Honey Hales, a singer. About an hour into the movie, they performed a dance called the karaoke. For 3 minutes, they danced with their foreheads touching, creating a magical connection that thrilled audiences. People couldn't take their eyes off them, and even though they weren't the stars of the movie, they completely stole the show. Flying Down to Rio made $1.5 million during the Great Depression, and much of its success came from that single dance. After Flying Down to Rio, studio executives saw their incredible chemistry and decided to pair them in more films. Between 1933 and 1939, they made 9 movies together. Their most successful movie was Top Hat in 1935, which earned over $3 million, a huge amount back then when tickets cost just 25 cents. That movie included the famous cheek-to-cheek dance, where Rogers wore a dress covered in 1,500 ostrich feathers. The feathers kept falling off during filming, which annoyed Astaire, but the result became legendary. Another standout movie was Swing Time in 1936. It had the famous Never Gonna Dance routine, which many people consider their best work. Filming that dance was exhausting. It took 47 takes and over 16 hours of shooting. By the end, Rogers' feet were bleeding, but she kept going because they both wanted perfection. Despite how close they looked on screen, Astaire and Rogers weren't close in real life. They were professionals and didn't spend much time together outside of work. Over their 9 movies, they danced together for a total of 530 minutes, performing around 10,400 steps. Astaire was a perfectionist. He would rehearse endlessly to make every routine flawless. For one dance in Follow the Fleet, he made everyone do 632 takes before he was satisfied. He also paid attention to every detail, like camera angles and costumes. He insisted on full-body shots in dance scenes because he believed cutting away from the feet ruined the magic. His perfectionism sometimes caused tension with Rogers. During the long filming of Never Gonna Dance, she was in pain but kept going to get the perfect shot. She later admitted Astaire was the most demanding person she ever worked with, but she also admired his dedication. Fred Astaire's career changed a lot after he stopped working with Ginger Rogers. He was 40 years old and unsure of what would come next. But Fred didn't give up. He took a huge risk by paying $200,000 to end his contract with RKO so he could control his own career. This decision let him choose his own projects and prove he could still be a star. His first movie without Ginger was Broadway Melody of 1940. In this film, he danced with Eleanor Powell, who was considered one of the best female tap dancers ever. Their dance to Begin the Beguine became famous, with one long, continuous shot that amazed everyone. But things didn't stay perfect. In Second Chorus, 1940, Fred played a character who wasn't very likable, and the movie didn't do well. Fred felt discouraged and even thought about retiring. Then came You'll Never Get Rich, 1941, where he danced with Rita Hayworth. This movie was a big success, earning over $1.5 million. It showed Fred could still succeed on his own and gave him a fresh start. Fred's new dance partners brought something special to his movies. He worked with Rita Hayworth again in You Were Never Lovelier, 1942. Their dance to The Shorty George was so fast and precise, it became an instant classic. Fred decided to retire for a short time in 1946, but he came back in 1948 to replace Gene Kelly in Easter Parade. This movie, where he danced with Judy Garland, was one of the biggest hits of that year. After that, Fred kept making successful musicals. In Royal Wedding, 1951, He performed the famous dancing on the ceiling routine, where he looked like he was defying gravity. It was filmed using a rotating room, which took 10 days to perfect and cost a lot of money. The result was unforgettable. In Funny Face, 1957, Fred starred with Audrey Hepburn. Even though there was a 30-year age gap between them, they worked beautifully together. Their dance to "Swonderful" in Paris, in front of the Eiffel Tower, became one of the most iconic scenes in movie history. Audrey was nervous about dancing with Fred because she didn't think she was good enough, but Fred helped her feel confident and gave her plenty of support. Fred was always trying new things in his movies. In Royal Wedding, he danced with a hat rack as if it were a partner. It took 57 takes to get it right. In The Bandwagon, 1953, he performed a 13-minute dance that mixed ballet, jazz, and tap. It was so difficult that Fred, who was 54 years old at the time, lost weight just from rehearsing. In Daddy Long Legs, 1955, he performed a solo dance representing the Four Seasons. He had to change costumes 13 times during the routine, but he managed to film it perfectly in one day. Later in his career, Fred surprised everyone by acting in dramatic roles. In On the Beach, 1959, he played a scientist dealing with nuclear war, which earned him a Golden Globe nomination. People were impressed by how good he was at serious acting. In The Towering Inferno, 1974, Fred played a con man trapped in a burning skyscraper. He was 75 years old and gave such a strong performance that he got his first Academy Award nomination. Even though he didn't win, it showed how talented he was beyond dancing. On television, Fred won an Emmy in 1978 for his role in A Family Upside Down. He played an elderly man dealing with big life challenges. At 79 years old, Fred became the oldest actor to win an Emmy, proving his talent and versatility once again. In the 1950s and 60s, he turned to television and proved he could still amaze people in new ways. On September 30th, 1958, NBC aired An Evening with Fred Astaire, a special that changed how people saw TV. It was the first full-length show ever recorded in color, and it was a huge hit. The show won 9 Emmy Awards, which had never happened before. Astaire didn't stop there. He created 3 more TV specials: Another Evening with Fred Astaire in 1959, Astaire Time in 1960, and The Fred Astaire Show in 1968. Each show was creative and exciting. In one, Astaire danced on walls and ceilings, something no one had done on TV before. In another, he performed with jazz legend Count Basie, mixing his elegant dance style with Basie's energetic music. These TV specials brought Fred to a younger audience. He also teamed up with a new partner, Barry Chase, and their dancing was as magical as his earlier days with Ginger Rogers. The shows featured amazing sets, modern effects, and both classic and new songs. They proved Fred could stay fresh and creative, even in a changing world. By 1960, his impact on television was so big that he earned a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame for his TV work. He already had one for film. Fred's incredible career brought him many awards. In 1950, he received an honorary Oscar for how he changed musicals forever. Ginger Rogers, his most famous partner, gave him the award. Fred was so happy he joked, "I'm so thrilled I'm ready to do handsprings down Madison Avenue." Over the years, he won 5 Emmy Awards, including 3 for his TV specials. He also received the Golden Globe's Cecil B. DeMille Award in 1960. In 1978, he was honored with the Kennedy Center Honors for his lifetime contributions to American culture. Then, in 1981, the American Film Institute gave him their Life Achievement Award, recognizing him as one of the greatest stars in history. Even after his death, his legacy lived on. In 1989, he was inducted into the National Museum of Dance's Hall of Fame. Fred didn't just entertain, he changed how people thought about dance. In his films, he made sure the camera focused on the dancers, showing their movements clearly with as few cuts as possible. He wanted people to feel like they were watching live. Fred also believed dance should be part of the story, not just a random performance. This idea made his movies stand out and inspired musicals for decades. His graceful style became a standard for ballroom dancing, and his sharp suits and top hats made him a fashion icon too. Even today, people still look up to his elegance. Dancers like Mikhail Baryshnikov have said no one else could match Fred's genius. Fred's final movie was Ghost Story in 1981, a big change from the musicals he was known for. At 82 years old, he played a serious role in this horror film about four old friends haunted by their past. The cast included other Hollywood legends like Melvyn Douglas and Douglas Fairbanks Jr. Fred didn't dance in the movie, but his performance showed he could still command attention. Filming was hard for him because of the cold locations, but he stayed professional and impressed everyone on set. The movie earned $23.3 million at the box office, which was good for a horror film back then. While it wasn't a flashy ending to his career, it showed his courage to try new things, even late in life. Fred Astaire had two important marriages in his life. The first was to Phyllis Potter, a New York socialite, when he was 34 years old. He married her on July 12, 1933, after chasing her for 2 years, even though his mother and sister were strongly against it. Back then, it was shocking because Phyllis was divorced and had a young son. Despite the criticism, their marriage lasted 21 years until she died of lung cancer on September 13, 1954. Fred was heartbroken when she passed. Much later, something surprising happened. At 81 years old, Fred married again. His second wife, Robin Smith, was a jockey and only 35 years old, which created a huge 46-year age gap. They met in 1973 at the Santa Anita racetrack, where Robin was one of the first female jockeys in America. Despite their age difference, their shared love for horse racing brought them close. They married on June 24, 1980, and Robin stayed by his side until his death in 1987. After Fred passed away, Robin fought to protect his name and image, even going to court many times to stop people from using it without permission. Fred was a very private and humble person, even though he was so famous. He didn't like Hollywood parties or big events. Instead, he spent time with his family, cared for his racehorses, or worked on his fruit-growing projects. He also hated the idea of anyone making a movie about his life. He included a rule in his will that said no one could make a film biography about him. He explained, "I don't want my life to be misunderstood." Fred didn't see himself as special, even though everyone else did. He was one of the best dancers ever, but he often said dancing wasn't anything deep for him. He once said, "I just dance," as if it was no big deal. But Fred had some insecurities. He thought his hands were too big and would curl his fingers slightly while dancing so people wouldn't notice. Most didn't even realize he did this, but it shows how much he cared about every little detail. Fred worked incredibly hard at everything he did. He was a perfectionist and pushed himself to the limit. Before filming any dance, Fred would practice for weeks to make sure everything was flawless. He was so dedicated that he once spent days perfecting just a few seconds of a performance. All this hard work sometimes wore him out. One time, he was seen on an empty movie set, looking completely exhausted. He told a friend, "Why doesn't someone tell me I can't dance?" It was a rare moment where he admitted how much pressure he felt. Fred also had complicated relationships with his co-stars. He made 10 films with Ginger Rogers, and their partnership became legendary. But at first, he didn't want to work in another duo because he had already done that with his sister Adele. He even wrote to his agent saying he didn't want to be part of a team again. Still, his work with Ginger became unforgettable. Fred's high standards could sometimes frustrate his co-stars, but he was also kind. When Debbie Reynolds struggled with dancing during Singin' in the Rain, Fred found her crying under a piano. Instead of scolding her, he invited her to watch him practice. He wanted her to see that even he made mistakes and got frustrated. This gave her the courage to keep going. Even Michael Jackson, who idolized Fred, admired his work ethic. He said Fred practiced more than anyone else and worked harder than people realized. Fred might have been demanding, but he inspired everyone around him with his dedication and kindness. In 2002, something amazing happened. Tony Charmoli, who worked as a TV director and choreographer, found a hidden treasure by accident. He was at Hermes Pan's house, a famous choreographer, helping set up a big new TV. While moving some cables, Tony discovered an old film reel hidden in a closet. At first, Pan thought it was just some random thing he'd kept for years. But it wasn't random. It was a long-lost dance routine by Fred Astaire called Me and the Ghost Upstairs from the 1940 movie Second Chorus. For over 60 years, no one had seen this dance, and people didn't even know if it still existed. Tony realized right away how special it was. He played the reel and even videotaped it, just in case something happened to the original. That turned out to be a smart move, because the original film and another copy on Betamax later disappeared. Now, Tony's grainy video is the only proof this routine ever existed. The routine was 4 minutes long, and Fred Astaire danced to music written by Bernard Hannigan, with lyrics by Johnny Mercer. Astaire had recorded the song, but the dance was cut from the movie and forgotten. Until this discovery. This routine is extra special because it's the only time Fred Astaire and Hermes Pan ever danced together on screen. In the performance, Pan played a ghost. He wore a long gray sheet, which made him look tall and spooky. The dance started with Astaire singing funny lines like, "It's an ectoplasmic tapping that disturbs my nightly napping, making it light-hearted and playful." Then, the dancing began. The two moved perfectly in sync, their steps smooth and creative. In one surprising moment, the ghost picked up Astaire, swung him around, and even sat him on its lap. This kind of humor and boldness was rare for that time. What made it even more impressive was Pan's costume. He was under the sheet and wore high heels, but still managed to pull off tricky moves like spins and lifts. The routine mixed different dance styles, tap, ballroom, and even modern dance. It wasn't just about steps, it used the whole stage. Pan would move behind Astaire and suddenly appear again, making it feel like a ghost was really floating around. Their hand movements were detailed and elegant, adding to the fun and story of the dance. The rhythm was another amazing part. They didn't just follow the beat of the music. Instead, they played with it, doing steps that made the dance feel exciting and full of surprises. Watching it, you could see why Fred Astaire and Hermes Pan were considered such brilliant artists. Finding this routine changed how people thought about Fred Astaire. He was known for dancing with female partners, but this routine showed a different side of him. It was playful, experimental, and broke the usual rules of dance. Pan wearing heels and playing the ghost added a unique twist that was ahead of its time. The routine also proved just how skilled Astaire was. The moves were more complex and creative than most of the dances in his movies. Because of this discovery, dance historians started looking for other lost routines, hoping to find more hidden gems from the golden age of Hollywood. Today, Me and the Ghost Upstairs is studied in dance schools and film classes. People admire it for its creativity and technical brilliance. Even decades later, Fred Astaire continues to inspire and amaze everyone.